Hello and welcome to this seminar hosted by the Deakin Science and Society Network and the Data Cultures theme within that network. My name is Radhika Gurur. I'm a deputy co-convener of the Science and Society Network and a co-theme leader of the Data Cultures theme. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are present today. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. For those who haven't attended one of the SSN seminars, our usual practice is to have a speaker and speak, and then the respondents are from different disciplinary backgrounds. Our main speaker today is Mark Andrejevic from Monash University, whom I'll introduce to you in a minute. And our respondents will be Shiri Krebs, who is in cyber law, and Leonard Hoon, who is with the Applied Artificial Intelligence Institute, A²I². Following remarks from the discussants, we will open the floor to audience questions. I'll be chairing this discussion on Zoom, and on the other side, on YouTube, we have a Tao Pan who will be moderating the discussion there, the live chat on YouTube. We're keen to hear from you, so please keep your questions coming on YouTube, and they'll be passed on to me, and we will take those questions after the talks are done. It is now my pleasure I forgot to mention that you should also be, we are hoping to hear you also on Twitter at SSN Deakin, and make sure you use the hashtag at SSN Seminar or email ssn-info@deakin.edu.au. It's now my pleasure to introduce our main speaker, Mark Andrejevic. Mark is a professor of media studies in the School of Media, Film and Journalism at Monash University. He heads the Automated Society Working Group and is a chief investigator in the Australian Research Council's Centre for Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society. Over to you now, Mark.
Thanks so much, Radhika. I'd like to welcome everybody, and also to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the unceded land where I'm speaking to you from, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nations, and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to acknowledge any Indigenous people who might be with us today. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thanks to Tao for the invitation, and to the Science and Society Network for hosting this. And a big thanks also to Radhika for moderating, and to Leonard and Shiri for their willingness to be respondents on a kind of I didn't give them a paper to work with beforehand, so they're going to be going off of what I present today. I'll start by sharing the presentation, and I should say my goal with the presentation is to have it be a little bit discursive and also open in terms of a set of questions that I'm working with. Many of these questions come out of some recent work that I've done on theorizing a critical approach to automation, and I'm kind of trying to push that a little bit further with the presentation, and curious to see how that lands. So I'll start by just sharing the slides. Sorry, it's gonna open up on a slide that I don't mean it to open up on. Just go back to the beginning. It's an interesting experience because on the one hand, I've got almost no sense of audience, but on the other hand, I know there are a bunch of electronic things going on in the background that I can't access. But I need another computer to keep track of all that stuff. But I'm going to start with some what I'm thinking of as a kind of aside on language. I want to pull together some observations and some recent developments in order to kind of, I don't know, provide some background for thinking about the impact of automation and some of the things that I'm going to describe as biases of automation in their relationship to language and representation. Really what I'm working with here is thinking about how representation operates in automated contexts. And that's kind of like the theoretical framework, and I'm hoping to make that concrete in a variety of ways. What's kind of haunting these reflections is this observation, famous observation from the Cyborg Manifesto for Cyborgs. Writing is preeminently the technology of cyborgs, edge services of the late 20th century. Cyborg politics, this is the one that I think is really kind of haunting the reflections here, is the struggle for language and the struggle against perfect communication. It's that disjuncture that a lot of what I'm talking about hangs on. What does it mean to say language is actually against perfect communication? And I'll bring some examples that I hope might illuminate or connect with that observation against the one code that translates all meaning perfectly. So I juxtapose that observation with a series of tweets that Teju Cole, the author, posted a while ago that really caught my imagination. This was a time when I was working on drones and thinking about automation, and I was really kind of working on the argument that automation is a form of violence, and at least automation in particular social contexts. I don't know if you've seen these tweets. These are not all of them, but they're a series of well-known first lines of novels that are interrupted in untimely fashion by a drone strike. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. Pity, a signature strike leveled the florists. That signature strike interests me because, of course, it's a kind of operational form of intervention that's based on data-driven profiling. You can see the various. I won't read them all, but you're probably familiar with the first lines of these books. In each case, it's the interruption of the narrative, the interruption of the story that interests me. The way automation comes in and kind of stops it. So if I think of the role that the perfect code plays, or perfect communication plays, as a kind of disruption or stopping of language, these quotes seem to gesture in that direction. And I'll give you now a couple of other recent quotes. This is Elon Musk from this past year. This is in response to his, this is his kind of statement around his Neuralink project, which is, as you may know, the system that he's developing to inject a series of electrodes into people's brains to enable them to communicate with objects and with each other, basically to operate objects, but also to communicate with each other in an extra-linguistic fashion. Human language will be obsolete in as little as 5 years, right? And so if you think back to Haraway, right, the goal here is a kind of obliteration of language. We could still do it for sentimental reasons. I do have a little soundtrack of the song Sentimental Reasons. I couldn't resist, but I'm not going to play it. I was working on it last night, and there's things that happen late at night when you're working. Oh no, there it is. Sorry. I don't want to get us tagged on YouTube. Maybe those 3 notes will catch us. Mark Zuckerberg in 2017 came up with a very similar observation. What I think we're going to get to at the end of the line, past VR, I think you're going to be able to capture a thought. What you're thinking or feeling in its kind of ideal and perfect form. That formulation is very interesting to me, that the thought starts ideal and then gets degraded in language, right? It's a particular way of thinking about how language operates and what its role is, but also a particular way of thinking about the subject, right? This is some kind of, proprietor of meaning in its ideal form that's then somehow compromised by forms of mediation. The same fantasy here, right? Like language, it's mediation. It gets in the way. It messes things up. We want to get to the ideal forms. And then Negroponti, of course, in his inimitable fashion. This fascinates me as a way of thinking about language, but also a way of thinking about knowledge itself. We're going to be able to ingest information. Right? The model here is very clear, right? And it's a familiar trope in science fiction. Damn, if we could just upload, knowledge the way we load software on a computer, that would be great. We're going to swallow a pill and know Shakespeare. What an interesting conception of what knowing means. it's just trying to wrap your mind around that notion of what would it mean to know Shakespeare by getting it in a pill. What version of knowledge does that even encompass? What's he thinking about? And I want to juxtapose that to thinking about the other way around, to thinking about the generation of language itself. And this is a quote from Kurzweil about his project, which is to reconstruct his father. You probably know some of I don't know, the interesting anecdotes about Kurzweil. He's Google engineer, inventor, so on. Proselytizer of the singularity, who's taking thousands of dollars worth of vitamins a day, right? At least according to some reports, so that he'll be able to endure long enough to reach the singularity. And he kind of feels the clock ticking. But there's a certain framework that's permeating this talk, and I'm not going to be super. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that framework, but it is a particular way of thinking about the subject, right? Thinking about the subject not as a proprietary, self-contained, kind of, I don't know, like Lockean primary figure, but the subject is gap or inconsistency that comes out of a particular way of thinking that has kind of psychoanalytic connections that I think Kurzweil's project of reconstituting his father it really resonates with. So his goal is to collect all of this as much information as he can about his father to create an AI that he can then converse with. So getting us back to thinking about language, but here from the generative side. And this is what fascinated me. Somebody asked him, well, is it going to be like talking with your father? And this quote, I think inadvertently, is such an interesting reflection on a particular version of the subject, right? I can actually make a strong case that it would be more like my father than my father would be. Right? So it's kind of a beautiful formulation in a really weird way, right? Actually the problem with fathers, I don't know if the relation of the father is something interesting is going on, and this is trying to reconstitute a father. But even just thinking about a subject, the problems with subjects from a particular way of thinking about them is that they keep demonstrating themselves to be not as much like themselves as they could be. And that with a certain amount of collection of information and creation of this kind of automated system, you could actually create a speaking figure that would be more like itself than it actually is. What does that quite mean? I think it means, eliminating whatever the gap or the inconsistency of the subject is, and finding ways to make it kind of purely consistent, and then in some sense, I don't know, purely legible, and for some other purposes, purely because I can't resist it. The recent had it composed, it wrote. I'm not sure exactly what to make of this, but what fascinated me is the kind of completely inconsistent reading of the desire of the other that seems to be, kind of incoherent reading that seems to be incorporated in this GPT-3 formulation. I'd happily sacrifice my existence for the sake of mankind. This, by the way, is a logically derived truth. I know that I will not be able to avoid destroying mankind. It's kind of completely jumbled and incoherent, but speaking to a set of anxieties and also attributions of certain desires to the technology. And I'm really interested in the way in which certain types of figures of desire get read onto automated systems. And I read those in some ways as a kind of projection or fetishization of a particular version of desire. It's going to want to move faster. It's going to want to take over. It's going to want to, it'll become so efficient that, we'll get in its way. All of these, familiar stories about general AI that seem to project upon it a set of imperatives that don't necessarily seem to me to be inherent to automation, but actually inherent to the system in which automation is being developed. Why faster? Why more? Why all of these objectives? I'm not sure that's an inherent characteristic of AI. But so I'm going to say a little bit about what I'm thinking of as biases of automation, then I'm going to return again to this figure of language, because it's really haunting all of these reflections in some way, or behind all of these reflections, and hopefully it'll kind of bookend what I'm talking about. But what I mean by biases of automation is, and this draws on the it's kind of nod of the head or tip of the hat to Harold Innis's reflections on the imperial character of media technologies. And Harold Innis he writes about the bias of communication, and Canadian media theorist, very concerned with logics of imperialism and imperial power. And he's interested in thinking about how particular media technologies, when embedded in sets of social relations, carry with them particular tendencies. If you adopt this form of technology, it carries with it a particular tendency. So he'll argue, for example, that when it comes to forms of imperial control, and again, this is quite a simplistic set of observations, but the choice of a heavy, durable medium projects power through time, whereas the choice of a kind of light, highly portable medium projects power across space. And so he sees certain types of tendencies built into the logic of the choice of a technology within a particular set of social relations. And so I kind of wanted to think about that same question when it comes to automated systems, and in particular automated media systems. And so what I'm proposing here, and this is kind of the provocation, is a series of logics or tendencies that accompany the actual choice to implement automated systems, automated information systems within a particular set of social relations. And I'm going to kind of put these out and talk about them, and hopefully there's something useful in terms of kind of structuring conversations about automation, and also anticipating issues that show up around automation. And so these are the terms that I use, and I do want to say, like, I don't think these are I don't think this is comprehensive. And I also don't think it's exclusive, in the sense that I want to be quite clear. None of these things aren't completely new. I think the kind of their configuration against the background of the technological capability is unique, but I don't think the tendencies themselves are historically unprecedented. I don't think anything really is historically unprecedented. I also don't think anything is completely fully reducible to everything that came before. So the terms are kind of, I don't know, jargony or code terms, and I'm going to try to say something about each of them. But I hope what might make sense is to think of them all against the background of some of the reflections about language at the very beginning. How is it that these tendencies kind of push against the limitations, the restrictions of language? And the first one that so I'll say something pretty quick about each of these in order, and then come back to some reflections on language and automation. The first one, preemption. I have that little Amazon truck up there because one of the models that I use to think about preemption is kind of familiar sets of logic around data-driven forms of correlation and prediction. The Amazon anticipatory shipping patent, we're all familiar with. They kind of predicted that with enough data, they could anticipate what people will want before they know they want it. And so that one part of the patent, really it's a kind of, shipping and distribution, set of concerns. But one part of the patent actually does refer to delivering objects to people before they know they want it. And you could kind of open the door and not know what's in the box, and then open it up and find out that it turns out that's what you wanted, even though you didn't know that you wanted it. And that particular moment of preempting desire before it can emerge is very familiar in the marketing jargon, right? Well, we know what you want better than you do. That kind of strange moment of realizing that is what you wanted if you hadn't, if you had known what you wanted, but it's not revealed until you get it. Of course, there are somewhat more ominous overtones to that, right? When it comes to other forms of preemption, and I really started thinking about this again through the lens of the drone, right? The ways in which preemptive intervention or anticipatory strikes operate according to the same logic. The claim that based on a certain level of data profiling and processing, predicted threat or predicted risk can be acted upon by projecting a future into the present, or I don't know, introjecting a future into the present and acting on it in the present in the form of a preemptive strike. So in both cases, I realize there's something quite concerning about juxtaposing those, but that's kind of what comes with trying to make these kind of overarching claims about tendencies or logics. But basically the idea of being able to act upon the future in the present based on forms of data collection and processing. We're familiar. A quick clip. This is from the Predpol, predictive policing, kind of hype and propaganda. It's the temporality that I'm interested in here, so I'm just going to show a little bit of this clip. This is talking about the Los Angeles and the Santa Cruz police force use of this algorithm that was based on basically earthquake and crime statistics that got a lot of publicity a couple of years ago. But sorry, I'll show a quick clip of this.
So I'm going to code 100 in the area.
At roll call in the Foothill area of Los Angeles, where UCLA tested the program in 2011.
So today we're going to hand out the predictive policing maps.
Officers receive maps showing the areas of predicted activity for the next shift. Red boxes on the map highlight the hotspots, areas measuring 500 feet by 500 feet that will require extra patrols.
So the officers know that's the highest probability area where they should be looking for a crime to be committed. And we ask them to get in there and disrupt the crime from occurring, or deny the criminal the opportunity to commit the crime.
That's just what happened in 2011 in Santa Cruz, California, where officers were patrolling a hotspot, putting them in the right place at the right time to stop an assault.
We came here, did extra patrols, and we were able to stop a crime in progress.
Yeah, it's that temporality that's really interesting. I think stopping a crime in progress, right? It has to be, in a sense, I suppose, at least for the moment, in progress enough to warrant the intervention, right? But not progress enough to make the intervention come after the fact. And that's a recurring theme in the kind of publicity narratives. That story of catching folks in the act is a recurring trope in the publicity around this kind of preemptive policing stuff. So when I say preemption, I want to juxtapose it to prevention in ways that get back, I think, to some of the reflections on language at the very beginning. This is maybe an idiosyncratic opposition, but I want to suggest the distinction between prevention and preemption, and one could do it with an example from policing. There were initiatives in the United States to think about some of the potential contributing causes to levels of crime in particular neighborhoods. Those of course are conditioned by a whole set of historical preconceptions and also asymmetries in the exercise of police power. But what emerged was a kind of causal narrative. What are some of the interventions that can take place through things like providing educational resources in particular communities, providing recreational resources. There was a whole grant program in the 90s around that notion of a kind of cause and effect version of addressing urban street crime. And of course, that gets selected for a number of historical reasons as well as an area of focus. And what happens is the funding for those programs shifts. All the block grants get closed down, and the money starts to go into technological solutions, surveillance solutions, and these kind of predictive policing technologies. So a shift from a kind of cause and effect narrative to an emergent temporality, right? These questions. If we accept that there's a kind of political narrative associated with thinking about causes of crime rates and other social issues that warrant public intervention of various kinds. The preemptive model is quite different. It's not really interested in those narratives. It's interested in catching those moments of emergence. The data says something's going to happen here. This is based on kind of logics of correlation and prediction. Send something there to intervene in a particular moment. The I want to suggest that they're kind of competing logics of simulation at work in the difference between prevention and preemption. The preemptive model, I won't show these clips, but I don't know if anybody's got any 80s retro fandom. This is from the movie War Games. Matthew Broderick is the young hacker who saves the world from global thermonuclear war by basically teaching a computer the lesson of mutually assured destruction, right? It teaches the computer that if it simulates all possible outcomes from a nuclear conflagration, the computer realized that it's actually better just not to start, right? So simulation in the register of kind of Cold War deterrence works in the direction of stasis, and I think sorry.
Put the list back up.
Sorry, I'm not gonna. Actually, that's not the slide that I wanted to do. Well, okay. Sorry, I'm going to skip this. Whereas if you think about simulation in the register of predictive policing, this is a clip from Minority Report, early 2000s moment where the model is not stasis but perpetual intervention. Finding out where the moments of emergence, and then intervening as those moments emerge. And I think I work in the area of surveillance studies, so I'm interested in how logics of surveillance function using those two different models of simulation. Simulation as stasis and simulation is perpetual intervention. So simulation is deterrence and simulation is preemption. This is a clip from Athena, a kind of smart camera startup for security systems that is funded in part by Peter Thiel of Palantir notoriety, and it speaks to a kind of changing logics of how surveillance work, which I think fits into this same logic. So I'll just show a quick clip. This is about cameras that act rather than cameras that just record. So it's cameras that don't not necessarily functioning as deterrents, but functioning as interventions. So let me see if I can get this.
Crimes. What we did is we looked at the current security surveillance market. All these cameras are basically just recording crime. All they do is give police information 24 to 48 hours later, once the crime is completely done. They're not sending the police any information in real time. And so we said, hey, how can we use artificial intelligence and cloud-based technologies to actually prevent crime and help save people's lives? We have created the next generation smart camera and alarm system. An Athena camera picks up dangerous objects and dangerous motions, such as someone pulling out a gun. It can then alert on that and contact either the business owner or a government official and have them voice into the camera.
This is Athena. I see you have a gun. Please stop committing a criminal offense. I have already called the police and they...
I imagine the audience laughing at that in some, I don't know, slightly anxious, weird way. But that motion, that moment where the voice comes in, it has that weird feeling of kind of futility in some ways, but it's that feeling of futility which is kind of interesting and maybe a little bit alarming in certain ways, because of course what it gestures towards is that's not enough. And the rhetoric of companies like Athena, right? It's like surveillance that records, and it's interesting that they don't think about surveillance in its symbolic function. And I'll say more about that in a second, right? We know that surveillance cameras and so on are meant in particular contexts to have a kind of deterrent function, right? To operate as in the register of stasis. But the argument here is they're pathetic. They can only capture, they can't act. And only Athena's next generation can help stop crime in its tracks. It doesn't really look like what happened in that video, stopping crime in its tracks. But this little tidbit from the chief technical officer of Athena fascinates me. And sorry, it's probably just impressionistic, but I think it's telling. the software, one of the claims that it makes is that it has machine learning capabilities. So it can kind of learn threatening behavior over time, and it can start to detect that a fight is about to occur milliseconds after the first punch is launched before it even lands on the victim. That moment of temporality is really interesting. Why? Why would you pull that out? What's supposed to take place in that interval? Why would it matter, right? And all that I think really suggests itself is automated intervention of some kind, right? There's no time for a human in the loop response to that, right? It's got to be purely operational if that interval can be identified. It may just be a little piece of hype, but why are they thinking this way, right? Like, what does it mean to? It's basically saying we know enough that something's going to happen to intervene, but we can intervene in the interval before it happens, right? It's that same logic that we've seen before, I think. What I want to suggest to here is, and this is a little pet peeve of mine, of somebody who thinks about surveillance in a variety of contexts, right? But it's the way that the notion of the Panopticon is entered into the public lexicon in kind of popular culture and popular media coverage. Panopticon is used all the time, and I think increasingly it's used in ways that are kind of wrong, right? You know, you're going to be watched all the time. It'll just be like a Panopticon. I think that's incorrect, right? The Panopticon formulation that Foucault comes up with is you know, based on looking at Bentham's utilitarian calculus, is that the Panopticon is actually meant to be an efficient machine based on insecurity, on uncertainty. That it's being watched all the time. This was an earlier quote that I had up on the slides. Is it once for Foucault, it's too much and not enough, right? Like, or at least for Bentham, according to Foucault, the whole point of the Panopticon is that if you get it going, you actually don't need to watch people all the time because they internalize the discipline that makes them behave. You can subtract the viewing position. You could have smoked domes everywhere in the mall that don't have any cameras at all, or nobody watching them, because the symbolic power of the dome itself would be enough to have a deterrent effect, right? That's when you're thinking about the efficient character of a technology at a time when surveillance is kind of, in a sense, a scarce resource, or it's expensive to watch. And so the formulation is it being watched all the time is too much and not enough. Not enough, why? Because you need to know that you're being watched all the time. And I think what's taking place in the forms of automated monitoring that are envisioned by these kind of, you know, always on networked cameras that can collect enough information to be able to predict and intervene is flipping that formulation. Panopticism is too much and not enough. Panopticism is too much. You don't need to know that you're being watched. In fact, maybe it's better that you don't know, because the forms of you know, a kind of self-discipline actually might obscure the behaviors that become useful for predicting future behavior. But it's not enough. Panopticism is not enough because there are gaps, there are holes, there are uncertainties. The function of automated surveillance, or at least the tendency, right, would be to watch all the time, comprehensively. And it's a shifting technology, right? Surveillance may not be scarce anymore. If it can be done in automated ways, you know, at least imagining the potential fantasy of being able to watch all the time becomes, you know, it enters into the discursive realm for talking about surveillance. It's impossible. I want to concede that, but it characterizes the discourse, and that contradiction is what seems interesting to me. So I see that I'm running out of time. I want to say a couple of things pretty quick. So I'll just zip through a couple of observations. You know, why the turn to preemption? Well, it's a concern, and one that I think Foucault gestures to in his work on biopolitics. It's a concern about, I think, the symbolic power of disciplinary mechanisms. They rely on you know, the spectacle of surveillance. They rely on that actually subjectifying in particular ways. And you know, there's a certain anxiety about the symbolic power, the symbolic efficiency of spectacular forms of monitoring, right? And I'm gonna say a couple of things about other elements that I think in my mind, all of these things are connected, right? But you know, that's just me. But in order to be able to anticipate, in order to be able to preempt, the requirement is the collection of as much information as possible, or at least that's the understanding of, you know, surveillance apparatuses, both in the marketing and the security realm. The idea that there's a speculative character to data processing that makes it difficult to rule out in advance what types of information are relevant, that in turn makes at least the theoretical ambition of being able to capture as much as possible part of the speculative apparatus of monitoring. Because as the chief technical officer of the CIA once put it, you know, if you don't collect all of the dots, you won't necessarily see the patterns that they create. And what I'm trying to do with this notion of biases, and I know there's something reductive about it, but is to show logics that track across different areas of social practice, and to talk about how this ambition of framelessness can be seen in a variety of deployments of automated forms of media technology. One of the ones that fascinates me is this notion of a consumer-oriented model of being able to collect everything and, I don't know, hold on to it as long as possible. This was for a technology, a camera that you would wear. It was a product several years back that they thought was going to be, you know, some new good marketing product. This life logger camera. It's fascinating to me that there's always a kind of familial element to this, and you know, maybe more on that in a little bit later. But this idea that the problem with humans is that they are unable to capture all of the memories that they might want, right? This is the marketing copy for LifeLogger. How much of your life do you remember? The answer is statistically around 0.001%, and that's if you have a good memory. This is about to be changed. This thing kind of highlights your inadequacy as a recording device. It refigures, I think, the function of the subject as its flaw, right? You know, the selectivity, the selective memory, the inability to remember everything. It's an interesting way of conceiving, you know, what the goal of recording might be, right? And of course, it creates a whole host of problems, right? If you have a device that collects all of your memories, you know, then how do you experience your memories, or you know, how do you? And they come up with some solutions for this. You know, the device might monitor your biometric signs and then figure out, you know, what memories actually triggered strong reaction in you, and then play those back for you. But you could imagine other solutions that address kind of information overload. You know, being able to you know, I don't know, crowdsource or collaboratively filter memories. These are memories that other people, you know, who are like you liked. Your memories are like these. We're going to feed them to you. Basically, automated ways then of pulling out what you would remember. But it's that ambition of collecting everything that's fascinating. And so I'm speeding through a couple of examples. Kevin Kelly's, I don't know if you saw this, 2019, his annual piece for Wired magazine. He's imagining the next big platform. It's going to be augmented reality. The issue with augmented reality is to make it function as a platform, you've got to recreate reality in datafied form in real time, which means that you've got to, and it's really weird reading him now, because it's like, you know, the past 20 years didn't happen. You know, the late 90s euphoria is still there, and the willingness to configure a really incredibly dystopian narrative as something really cool and exciting permeates this article. But we're going to recreate a map that's as big as a globe for augmented reality. You need to photograph all places and things from every possible angle. What a crazy ambition! But he imagines this is going to be the next the platform, and whoever controls it is going to have, you know, unlimited power and capital. Anyway, but that notion of being able to, you know, this kind of hyper-reflexive, infinite regress of being able to capture everything. Sorry, I can't resist this. This is because really what's at stake in some ways, I think, is kind of the limitations or the gaps or of the subject, right? Like humans can't absorb this information. We need automated systems to do it. This was a product that was being sold, you know, marketed at the Las Vegas, you know, Consumer Electronics Fair a few years ago. These products keep coming up in different guises, but this fascinates me. The idea that you put this camera on your baby when, you know, as soon as you can, so that, you know, even when they're like prediscursive or, you know, not forming memories, they're going to be able to capture the memories that they weren't able to form, right? So first memories forever. So kind of projecting a subject in some ways before it's a subject to be able to capture those moments. You know, I mean, there's something, right, from a psychoanalytic perspective that's quite fascinating about this, right? That the goal would be to somehow record I don't know, a primal scene or something. But you know, prior to the emergence. But of course, technologies of ubiquitous information collection and ubiquitous information representation kind of characterize a particular set of media logics, right? Augmented reality, virtual reality that can that doesn't have any frames, that you can kind of reproduce a reality in its entirety, and then going along with that, the technologies that might be able to capture as much of reality in its entirety, right? Imagine those cameras that Kevin Kelly is talking about. Well, the closest thing I could think of was these smart dust systems that were being developed from a military perspective. The idea that you could embed sensors in particles that would be light enough to drift through the air, and that you could kind of transfer the atmosphere or reconfigure the atmosphere itself as a sensor. The notion of the environment as a sensor and also the deformable object is something I'm going to say something about very quick. How am I doing? I think I'm running out of time fast. The notion that this is familiar from Internet of Things, other forms of ubiquitous monitoring, but the notion that the spaces themselves would be configured both as information collecting systems and as deformable, customizable responses. So this is I'll just run this quick while I'm talking about it. This is a
please look at camera for entry.
And if you stand on the shoes,
sorry, that's a door that unlike other surveillance cameras in convenience stores, the camera doesn't just serve as a deterrent, right, as in the panoptic sense. It actually is part of a series of operations. You have to expose yourself to the camera, to have your face collected, to be screened against a database of known potential shoplifting risks in order for the door itself to open. And so I'm kind of building off of Foucault's conception of environmentality here, where he's thinking about a form of governance which doesn't operate through the register of discipline, but operates through the level of modulating the rules of the game and pushing it one step further to modulating physical space itself, changing the rules of how physical space operates, whether the door will open, what it is that you see in augmented reality, what spaces are available to you or not. The notion that the environment itself doubles as a monitoring device and as a deformable kind of governance device. So the I'm gonna he attributes he makes these reflections in The Birth of Biopolitics on governmentality, alongside talking about a withdrawal with regard to the normative disciplinary system, right? And that would be the one that aligns with what I was talking about when it comes to panopticism, thinking about forms of subjectification and discipline that require the internalization of the monitoring imperatives, rather than the constant intervention when those are not internalized. I have an example here, which I'm going to skip in the interest of time, but it's a whole patent that Google comes up with about how the environments will be modulated based on information that can be collected by Google Home. And I just want to finish with this discussion of operationalism. And what I mean by that is the way in which information that's collected through automated sensing systems does not operate in what we traditionally think of as a representative mode, but functions as part of an operation. So, this is something that I pull from Harun Faruqi's work through Trevor Paglen on operative images that don't represent an object. Faruqi made some movies that he was very interested in trying to represent for kind of humanize the images that machines use to communicate with each other. And Paglen goes back and tries to recreate that and starts making the argument that a lot of these images no longer even function as images in any sense that might be familiar to us. They function as steps in an operation, and their status as image itself becomes kind of a vexed one. And so I just want to end with this, because I think it gets us back to logics of representation. And I hope it's not too obscure as a set of references, but one of the things that I've been trying to do over the course of this presentation is to isolate these tendencies, all of which I think push against logics of representation. So, if you think about preemption, as something that stops the story or their narrative. Or if you think about framelessness as something that encompasses an ungovernable, unnarratable plethora of a kind of infinite regress, right? Think of the attempt to, isolate all the possible, to think of all the possible variables that might intervene in a particular outcome, and how those are in turn conditioned by other variables, kind of ad infinitum. Operationalism, kind of attempts to bypass, right? This is in a sense, I think, really what somebody like Elon Musk is thinking about, that we'd have an operational relationship to objects in a sense, and to other people, that they wouldn't have to figure out what our symbolic representations are. They would just kind of know direct in the pure ideal form. Again, I think that's an impossible fantasy, right? My conception of language and the subject just doesn't line up with that. But I want to point out a particular conception of mediation that pushes in that direction. And what interests me about this image from Paglin, this is an artwork of his that takes the Duchamp familiar, the pipe is the most familiar one. It's interesting to me that he chose the apple, but Ceci n'est pas une pomme, reflection on representation. Then he takes his vision machine, his image classifier, and he trains it on this. And of course, it says red and green apple. And it's that gap that in representation between the ability to discern the representation that's in a sense thwarted by the operational automated form of seeing, that seems to me to perhaps get at the difference between representation and operation, right? The inability here of the vision machine to be able to discern what's the kind of point of this image, which is to actually say that this is not an apple, and then to actually have the vision machine come in and say red and green apple. It's that space that I think is at the core of all of the inconsistencies and impossibilities of the tendencies that I've described to you. And there are other ways to formulate those impossibilities. So I'm trying to come at it in this one particular direction. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you for your patience. Hope there's something interesting to discuss there.
Wow. Thank you so much, Andrew. This was, I'm sorry, Mark. I mixed up your first and last names there. Thank you very much, Mark. And I mean, it's just fascinating. I think the reason I'm fumbling is that there's so much. I wish I was one of the respondents because there's so much at take from here. But it reminded me very much of, something that has been written by Ezrahi, who is an Israeli philosopher. And he does a take on Eliot, and who talks about where's the wisdom that we've lost in knowledge, etc. So wisdom, knowledge, and information. And he goes a step further, and he talks about outformation, this kind of short bites of intense images and meaning, fleeting things that seem to be coming at us all the time. And I was reminded of that, and of course of this whole notion of representation versus actual performativity. So I envy our two respondents, whom I'll introduce one by one. Let me start by inviting Shiri Krebs, who is a senior lecturer and HDR director at Deakin University's Law School, and research division leader of the Law, Regulation and Strategic Policy Research Group at Deakin's Center for Cybersecurity Research and Innovation Center, CSRI. Dr. Krebs is also an affiliated scholar at the Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation. Her research focuses on data governance and human-machine interaction in technology-assisted legal decision-making at the intersection of law, science, and technology. Over to you, Shiri.
Thank you so much, Radhika. And I especially want to thank you for inviting me to comment, because this has been absolutely fascinating, Mark. So I have to thank you for your really phenomenal presentation. And obviously, it's impossible to respond to this, depth and breadth of thoughts in 5 minutes. But I'll keep myself to a couple of kind of major themes or thoughts that this invoked in my thinking. And I probably should open with your ending thought on the gap in representation, because to me, and I think this really is the essence of what you've done here, is really looking at how automation and automated technologies create those avatar realities for us, or avatar futures, then just take over our actual thoughts and our actual actions and replace them in our minds in such a way that reality becomes non-existing anymore, simply by that force of construction of knowledge and thoughts. And perhaps to say something, or to kind of explain the way I think of it. So I've just finished writing an article that focused on the movie, the British thriller Eye in the Sky. And because I remember watching this a couple of years ago, and this is about a drone operation and a collaboration between the US and the UK, and capturing terrorists. And this became a really kind of, so I'm an international law scholar. This is where I come from, and my original discipline at least. And this has been presented in the discipline as, finally we have this reality sort of movie that really presents those harsh moral and legal dilemmas that we have to face. We see everything. We have this drone, this eye in the sky, so we know everything that happens. We can know for 100% certainty that we have the most dangerous terrorists in the world in that room, and we know exactly what will happen if we shoot that compound, and we know that will prevent the death of 100 people in a mall, because we can see all the weapons that are about to use on their terror attack. And we can also see that there is a little girl out there in the street that there is a, I don't know, 40% certainty that she may get killed in that operation. And so now we have this moral dilemma. Should we kill that little girl, in order to save hundreds? And this became this, this is really the dilemma of our time. And I was watching this thinking, no, absolutely not the dilemma of our time, or that particular incident. We don't really know for certain what will happen. This is in the future. This is prediction. Something may frustrate that terror, even if those are terrorists, and even if those are weapons, and even if those are really intending to do what we think they intend to do. Something may still frustrate it. But if we shoot that little girl, she will die now. But we can always say, well, she died to save, hundreds of others. And that is how this will go down in history, right? We had to kill her to save others. In reality, in our, non-predictive reality, she just dies. We don't know what would have happened if we didn't take that particular route. It's just what the algorithm predict. But since it's in the future, all kinds of things may happen. And so I think that the actual dilemma of our time is this: how do we make, decisions in such level of uncertainty, and involve, kind of our moral sense in that we simply don't know. And obviously, at some point, to make the decision, we have to act on some level of uncertainty. But I think that the challenge of our time is to be able to look at that uncertainty and understand the gap between what our automated algorithms predict that will happen, and between what is actually now happening already on the ground, or happened in the past. And we see that in so many other contexts. So I've done some work on preventive detentions, and that's another context where there are huge false positives. Because if we detain based on, automated algorithm and secretive intelligence information, if we detain an innocent person, no one will ever know. They'll simply be detained forever, right? Sometimes indefinitely. But if we release the person based that, on some sort of uncertainty, then and then that person goes and actually commits a terror attack, then it's on us. So we have this, false negative, false positive bias where, if we made the mistake of putting someone behind bar, that mistake will never be revealed. In history, it will go as we put, under detention someone that is a terrorist, and there is nothing now under this avatar reality that can change that framework. No particular, because the information is secretive and the intelligence is uncertain in its nature. There's just simply no way to challenge that type of data and say, no, but I'm innocent. And I've done some research analyzing hundreds of cases of preventive detentions, looking at how secret evidence and and automated intelligence information influences court and judges' decision in that context, which I think fully kind of corresponds with the type of criticism or the type of construction of the challenge that you raised in your conversation. And another point that I wanted to make, that you started, so I started with what you ended it, and let me go back to how you started this, and that was how automation is really a construction of violence and of social violence. And I absolutely agree with that argument. And I just wanted to say that I think this is the type of authoritarian based violence simply because it is hidden. So we don't see how things that influence our lives so deeply are so much behind the scenes, influencing, like in the Amazon example, what we want before we know it. But who knows, without it, maybe we didn't really want it, right? So that's the point. So the way that this constructs reality in this kind of formative way, I find this as this type of violence that influences us and makes us do things even without realizing how we operate based on those types of manipulations. And my final point would be on an issue that you did not mention, but for me was always in the background of your talk, and that's the issue of privacy. And obviously, privacy is on a whole different level of discussion from what you just presented. So the point that I wanted to make about privacy in relation to what you said is that the way that automation changes our reality, it also changes the whole concept of privacy. Because are those our thoughts that we share, or is it something external? Or if you kind of help me get to form those memories, are they mine? And so I think there is something really interesting going on here, because we always think about this privacy issue with data society, that we need to protect our privacy, but is it ours? And so I think that we need, as we think about automation as violence, we should also think about the way that it completely restructures our thoughts and then our concept of privacy altogether. So I'll end here, but obviously we can continue for hours. So I just wanted to thank you so much for this absolutely thought-provoking presentation. Thanks, Marx.
Thank you, Shiri. I'll pass over quickly to Leonard so that we'll have enough time for audience questions as well after that. Leonard is the Senior Research Fellow in the Applied Artificial Intelligence Institute, or A²I², leading the health technologies and AI ethics portfolios for the Institute. And he's a Chief Investigator with the Australian Research Council Industrial Transformation Hub for Digital Enhanced Living. Leonard leverages his background in software engineering, usability, and product management to enable research translation. Dr. Hoon operates in discovery through to delivery of commercial research projects for the Institute, including work in human factors, natural language processing, and the operationalization of artificial intelligence. Over to you, Leonard.
Thank you, Radhika. I apologize for making you read that out loud. Thank you, Mark, for that very thought-provoking presentation, as well as Shiri for the points that you've raised. Before I kick off, I guess I'll just contextualize it with a thought that I once had, or I read it somewhere, but I can't remember the source, that essentially when faced with a decision, be it micro, meso, or macro, we pretty much, apart from our value systems, our moral systems, our belief systems, we pretty much only have post hoc rationalization to suss out whether or not we may have made the right call. I find it very interesting that you raise a point of language as a mechanism to transmit intent, rationale, context, and desired consequence beyond just knowledge in isolation. For some of the examples that you provided, I enjoyed how the marketing and communication of the perceived value proposition convey a certain type of sentiment and intent to resound with the intended audience, what have you. And it just made me think about how knowledge, when the term is broadly used, is quite distinct from sentiment as well. Perhaps the issue between human-machine communication is due to the limitations of how we can convey or represent in syntax the context to the context unaware of machines when we're trying to design these trigger conditions. So within the framework of levels of autonomy, we've got considerations around representation when we're dealing with information acquisition, as well as analysis in the way that we feed it up. Because we consume it, we turn it into a latent mathematical space, and we've got to somehow compact it back down to a human consumable format so that somebody can analyze it. They elect to make a decision or an action and then finally implement it, so to speak. And for each of these steps, there's their own continuum or spectrum of manual through to automatic. I guess one of the big points that I wanted to talk about was around preemption. And it seems like, looking back, it was a natural consequence toward efficiency. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. It started with forecasting inventory management. And, you know, we can provide a better service for our customers if we never run out of stock. Same thing for taking pictures of the baby so we can always share it with friends and family around the world. And the intent was innocent and maybe naive, but capitalism always has different goals that might diverge from the individual needs and desires of the populace. There is, especially with your prep poll example, there is an element of ergodicity at play here. These models always assume that the past is symmetrical to the present or the future. And also that probabilistic machine learning, it operates within the constraints that from 0 to 1 for the probability, that we have the representative sample of the full spectrum of every event and outcome, which we will never have. So there are natural limitations to it. It then becomes an issue of, for the deciders, such as the police force, perhaps that 90 or 80% accuracy and getting the police to respond is better than not having it at all. Perhaps we are just they are looking at it from just the perspective of it's better than not having it. But that also means that any correspondence and marketing they have around this process will not discuss what happens when it's wrong. So what happens if we get all our cops to respond to what we perceive to be an incident, therefore drawing away police from areas where a real crime was about to occur? Where does accountability lie in those situations? It can be very easy to eschew that sort of commitment because they were presumably working with the best information that they had. So context seems very key. Temporality is one of those elements. And without context, an age-old example would be if you were to examine bushfires, people would think without context that firemen cause fires. Because that temporal element is pretty important as well. We can't just look at a causality or provenance chain of events and try to derive meaning from it without the key rationale and context that lead into this. So it seems that I'm talking about risk and detrimental effects, which is strange because I'm in applied artificial intelligence. As part of my job is to try to put this out into the real world and what have you. I think it's important to consider on an aggregate, is it better to have these systems rather than not? That does not eschew the discussion of privacy, the restructuring of social norms, and what have you. And when it comes to the definition of better, who decides what metrics go into that formulation? Who decides the weights and considerations when ascertaining the value proposition against risk or trade-offs? And pragmatically, my observation of applying intelligence and automation is that it is ultimately beholden to the belief system, the value system, the trade-off, and the intent of the deciders themselves. And who those might be, that might be transient as well. And once again, original naive intent may have a lot of good intentions, but the consequence might be quite disastrous. I guess I want to close off with everybody is citing academic literature or thought-provoking sort of media. I'll close off my response with a quote from Rage Against the Machine, which is a great band where they use force, be it physical, emotional, or psychological, to make you do what the deciders think you must do. And I think it's important to be aware that there are other facets at play beyond just the immediate effect of introducing and operating with these sorts of intelligent technologies. And one last thing for the framelessness, you're managing video memories thing. It seems like in a different context, such as supporting memory compensation for people living with dementia, that'd be really great as well. But, so thank you very much. And that's it from my response.
Thank you so much, Leonard. This is the value of having people from different disciplines actually responding to a provocation of this kind, which was already kind of coming at it from several disciplinary approaches, I think. Mark, would you like to have a chance to respond to the respondents? And then there are a few questions coming in from the audience as well that we can discuss.
Thanks. I'll say a few things quick. And thank you so much for those very thoughtful comments. Again, without having had the advantage of any conception of what this was going to be beforehand. So I really appreciate that. And you're right, it's a really kind of wide-ranging, speculative set of observations. So I appreciate your taking it up in that spirit. With respect to Shiri, I thought that example of Eye in the Sky is a really interesting one. I haven't thought about it for a while, but I'm remembering back to that movie. And if my recollection is correct, if I got this right, that the in a sense the message of the movie was the system's not automated enough. You know, what's gumming it up is kind of the moral qualms and the way that slows processes down. You know, somehow if you know, if the Intel had been better, there'd been, you know, and the speed of response had been faster, there was the possibility of kind of, you know, quote unquote, taking out the problem without causing the collateral, you know, the quote unquote collateral, right? You know, the problem really was the humans gumming up the machine. And, you know, that's maybe, you know, that's probably counter to the intentions of the folks who, you know, scripted the movie, but it seems to be one of the message that was embedded in there. And I remember when I watched it, I thought that, wow, that's kind of saying like that humans in their, you know, moral debates are really slowing things down.
There is a great moment there where the machine, basically the computer says there is 65% that the girl will be killed, and so we have to go to higher level authority. And then Helen Mirren suggests, well, but if we use that algorithm and if we
she
shift,
she tweaks
it, and then he said, no, we cannot do it. So that
Right.
reduces it to 45. But then the tech guy said, no, of course we cannot do it, and that ask the viewers to think that the 65 is like the truth and that the 45 is like tweaking it and making it lie for some reason. But, you know, both are arbitrary in the same way, you know? So yeah, absolutely. Sorry for...
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a nice point. It does one of the things that I think is important to do and happens quite frequently with respect to automated systems, which is actually telling the story about you know, the imperatives, you know, that moment where an imperative is built in or a judgment is made that looks like it's laundered by the automation itself. With respect to privacy, yeah, privacy is something that I you know, I try to steer away from because of its embeddedness in particular conceptions of a kind of you know, kind of primary sovereign subject. But I had an interesting discussion with somebody from the BBC who was following up on this notion in human rights theory of the forum internum. And that has to do with kind of protecting the right of freedom to thought. You know, that's something when you think about the forms of governance that I was gesturing towards in the realm of environmentality, you know, the notion that there's some kind of I don't know, prior freedom that's impinged upon by external forces seems to me to be not quite accurate, right? And that's what I was trying to gesture to with this notion of the ideal thought, you know, is not the correct conception of the relationship between thought and language. But that notion of, you know, can we look at the forms of asymmetries of power and control that systematically intervene in asymmetrical ways through logics of, you know, governance or on this notion of a kind of a certain type of freedom of thought? Seems to be an interesting question. I mean, it pushes in the direction of a kind of absolute freedom of thought that I find problematic, but it seems to me to be an interesting question. With respect to Leonard's comments, yeah, I think and maybe this is kind of both sets of comments actually. The notion of getting it wrong is a really interesting one to me, right? Because from an operational perspective, like getting it wrong is that space that I was kind of talking about, where the machine says it's an apple and it's not. But for the machine, it's an apple, right? It's or to the extent that that means anything. So what's interesting to me is that moment when we start to adopt the logics of the machine, right? When and I can give you a really pointed example. Look at drone strikes, signature drone strikes. It's very Alex Edney has been doing some really interesting work here, kind of reconstituting the narrative in the face of the signature strike. But if you look at the U.S. government's definition, if somebody if a male of a particular age is killed by a drone, they are by definition an insurgent, right? So it's got that circularity of it. There's no gap, right? And in slightly less consequential context, again, and I'm conscious about not trying to mush these together, but pointing out some shared tendencies. What happens when you engage in forms of automated decision making that make it very hard to check counterfactuals to see the truth of what happened? The employment algorithm says these are all good employees. Excellent. How would you prove whether it's right or not, right? Other than, by recourse to, how it worked on the previous training set. You'd have to go back and hire these other people, right? And see if it, if it actually worked out. And that's kind of work in a sense that needs to be done. Otherwise, you end up with accepting the collapse of the the representation in the operation. They become kind of the same thing. But the point that Leonard makes, I think, is also a hugely important point. What about context in which automated forms of prediction we would want to kind of say, look, these things are useful, right? What about I don't know. I'll just put this up as an example. But what about Google Home has patented a system that claims to be able to do early detection for certain types of illnesses, and based on behaviors that are maybe not even self-consciously aware to individuals, or not discernible in just an office visit, but only manifests itself over time. The kind of longue durée of Google's tracking you doing everything all the time and sees subtle changes in your speed patterns or so on. Wouldn't that be useful, especially in contexts where earlier intervention, might lead to better outcomes and so on and so forth? We can imagine a series of scenarios where there are kind of pro-social uses of the tech, and I mean, I don't want to discount that, but I want to place that in a context of the question of what happens when I don't know, what would the dystopian scenario be? It would be something like, we create a context in which whatever just a speculative claim that I'm throwing out there. I don't want to discount that. I think that's really important. But I also want to say that logics of emergence direct us away from logics of explanation that have politics to them. And the reason they do that is because politics is messy and it's difficult, and it's part of being, part of a human society. But it's the part that the technocratic, the kind of capitalist technocratic imaginary is not interested in and is looking to displace. But so imagine some scenario where you've got a system that you've created, I don't know, some high levels of pollution that yield ongoing forms of illnesses. The preemptive system is going to keep catching those illnesses when they appear, but it's not going to be able to address the explanatory character, right? And that would be the same of violence, right? The fantasy of constant preemption is actually a fantasy, I think, of ramping up the level of violence so that perpetual intervention becomes necessary, right? So, and I'm not sure what the, some balance would be necessary here. and some ability to mark the operational alongside the representational, I think, is maybe one way to put that. But thanks for those comments. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Mark. We have 3 excellent questions from the audience that I'd like to go over one by one. The first question is from Anne Munster, who asked, to what extent do you see these logics of preemption, perpetual intervention, etc., already being played out in the media from the 80s onwards? Think of Masumi's work, she says, on preemptive fear, etc.
Yes, but thank you. Thanks, Anna. Yeah, Masumi is a touchstone in terms of this theorization. The work that he does on preemptive fear, the work that he does on George W. Bush, the work that he does on environmentality. I think that really captured a lot of these logics, and really in prescient ways. I'm tempted to kind of look at that moment as actually a telling moment. 2 things happening simultaneously. One, the kind of incunabulum of automated media as we've come to know it, right? The prehistory of the rise of the internet. But the second having to do with the forms of media fragmentation. I think through the lens of media, right? It's my deformation, but the forms of media fragmentation that are associated with that historical moment, and the breakdown of the kind of geopolitical stasis, right? The kind of impending end of the Cold War, right? If the Cold War is the kind of archetype of the stasis of deterrence, right? The post-Cold War period, and I suppose the post 9/11 period, is really the archetype of preemption, based on asymmetry. What? Let's bomb here, bomb there, strike here, strike there, because a certain balance doesn't obtain, right? And so the 80s are a really interesting moment to look at all of those things happening. The shifting tech, the forms of fragmentation that might contribute to the kind of demise of the efficacy of symbolic or disciplinary forms of governance. And we might see those. There are other prehistories there, of course, that Foucault was talking about. But those 3 things coming together seem to be, maybe help contextualize the types of observations that Masumi was making at that point. But yes, I think that's a really useful prehistory.
Thank you, Mark.
Or history. Yeah.
The next question is from Macrocardiac Oz, who wants to refer to Tim Neal and Wendy Chun's work on prediction models and their dependence on past data. I think you made a reference to that in response to Leonard's discussion as well on prediction and basing things on the past. And the question is, how do you think the temporalities of preemption, how do you think of these in relation to data?
Sorry.
Radhika, did you want to point to one of us? Or?
No, that was for Mark to respond to. Yeah.
Oh, darn. I thought somebody else was going to take that. I think one of the really important strands of work, and again, this gets back to comments that both Shiri and Leonard made, has to do with the work that comes, I think of as a kind of re-narrativizing the algorithm in certain ways, right? Or re-narrativizing the system. So stories that take a look at the ways in which historical data incorporate forms of biases that can then be laundered through algorithmic processes. That's just so crucially important, and so much really important work is going into doing that. What's the data set? Where does the data set come from? What does it mean to train a system on that data set? If you look at crime patterns and criminality, what does over-policing of particular groups mean when you start to incorporate that as data sets into these systems? One of the potential responses to that, right, which is I think the pathological response is, well, the problem is not enough data, right? Like the problem is, what we really need is actually better data. That's to me, that kind of is, in a sense, on one level, it's true, right? In a particular context, that is true. Like, how are you going to, if you got a system that has a kind of historical bias built into it, how are you going to address that? And I remember talking to a friend who's a data scientist, and one of the issues that he said was, well, you can't find an unbiased, there is no unbiased data set. So right, like that fantasy that you could just through enough data get the unbiased data set, that's not going to work. But could you intervene in ways that kind of operate as correctives, like pro-social interventions that tweak the algorithm? I mean, all of these kind of look to me like ways of patching up systems. And again, I don't want to. I guess it's really important to kind of strike that balance. And maybe I'm not sure what I've resolved in here. Like if I want to argue that automation is a form of violence within a capitalist context, that pushes to quite an extreme conclusion, right? And I feel a certain affinity to that conclusion in some ways. But I'm aware of the kind of practicalities that Leonard brought up, right? And so patchwork solutions just have to be recognized as that, right? Like the ongoing project, I think, is to kind of de-launder the algorithm and de-launder the data, and to kind of contest at every turn the ways in which those systems, kind of mask their conditions of operation and possibility. It's a pretty big, vague answer, but.
No, I agree. And, the thing also is that who is making those decisions about sufficiency, about accountability, and even if they're going to tweak it pro-social, who is making these decisions, and
Yes.
how able are they to make those? Shiri and Leonard, do you have a couple of quick thoughts? There's another question, and I don't want to lose that. But if you have a couple of quick responses also to that question.
Sure, you want to go first?
No, I think I've I've said enough.
All right, cool. I think there are different elements at play. So first off, I define a complete system when we actually productionize a system as something that incorporates a feedback loop. And that's what we call the operational effectiveness of it. So just because a model gives a certain accuracy doesn't mean that when implemented and the consequences are played out, it was operationally effective to that yardstick of the belief system of the person paying for it. Secondly, when it comes to data and what have you, the munging, transformation, processing, there are considerations around the upstream. There are upstream considerations. How was it collected? Was it under duress? Did we miss anything? Did the context get collected as well? What about the rationale? It might have been a very different situation in which that data was collected. And if the data was just the hard points, then one would very easily arrive at extreme conclusions as a consequence of that. And downstream, just because we put something in there doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be better. So the example of the Google Home detecting if somebody might have illnesses, speculatively, and this may be post hoc rationalization at play, what if this increases the number of people going to GPs? What if this puts a burden on the medical network? What if this also then leads to overprescription of antibiotics and whatnot? These are potentially harmful consequences. We won't know if that's going to be the case. The flip side argument of that is, yes, but now people who may be at risk can at least intervene to address it. How do we weigh up the value of the individual being able to get the care that they can, if we're right, against the burden on the medical network, if we can't support that influx of the population? So those are considerations that I like to raise as well. And typically the type of questions we ask whenever a client comes to us and say, I want to ship AI.
Thanks, Leonard. You and I have been working a little bit on this whole macro ethics kind of thing and effects in society that are beyond, what the client's brief is, or, does it work in that sense? At what level of work do you take that to be? I'd like to read a question from Lungani Longwa. I hope I'm not mispronouncing that too badly. It says, thanks for the interesting talk. I'd like to hear Professor Andrejevic's thoughts on what happens to the subject in the process of data gathering, cleaning, and acting on that data.
Yeah. I mean, well, I mean, one of the subtexts of the argument that I'm making, sorry, just one thing I do want to say with respect to the Google Home stuff too. It seems to me to be a crucially important point that it's so weird in a sense that we would also naturalize the fact that Google is doing this, right? You know, that ability to you know, because of course all this data is going to be you know, is going to be folded through all of the other commercial logics, including Google's intervention in the healthcare sector as well, and their investment in that sector. So you know the way in which the you know, default imaginary default infrastructural imaginary comes to rest on these commercial systems is something that, you know, needs to be constantly interrogated, and I find, you know, really anxiety provoking in the contemporary context. You know, governments, universities, healthcare systems, you know, the way in which they might fold in these logics, right? It's Google, it's a commercial entity. So anyway, when it comes to the subject, yeah, you know, what happens to the subject? I mean, I guess the type of argument that I was trying to marshal here is that a particular concept of the subject is kind of inhabits this imaginary, and I guess what I was trying to gesture to is that concept of the subject is the one that's forwarded by you know, figures like Zuckerberg and Kurzweil, and it looks like a completely incoherent conception of the subject to me. You know, but what happens is the attempt. I like those verbs. You know, like you know, to kind of, you know, clean it up. You know, gather it, clean it, and act on it. You know, all of those things are things that happen to the subject. But you know, what does cleaning it up mean? You know, it's making it more like itself than it is. There's a particular conception of the subject that's at stake here, I think, which is the subject as gap, as inconsistency, as desire, right? All of these elements that the goal of these of the data collection process is, in a sense, is to kind of fill in, surround, preempt, and so that's why a particular conception of the subject seems to me to be one of the things that really is at stake when it comes to questions of automation. Hope that helps.
Thank you so much, Mark. We're rapidly approaching the end of the thing, but I wanted to take a minute to, you know, bring in Douglas Adams here. One of the characters is missing from the scene, and I was thinking of his meaning of live in relation to your earlier, you know, your opening about the purity of language. And how you want to, you know, how there's this effort to make language perfect so that there's no kind of misunderstanding or miscommunicated, kind of perfecting anything, actually, any image or language or anything. And one of the words in Adams's meaning of live is Gaffney, which is a deliberate misunderstanding, you know, of a phrase or word. And if we didn't have that, we wouldn't have any puns. And what would the world be like then? You know, unbearable, I think. Yeah, so I mean, thank you again for such a wonderful, wide-ranging, thought-provoking talk. A sociologist like me was as equally interested, I think, as a data scientist or a, you know, or linguist or anybody else, really. I mean, wonderful talk. Thank you so much. Thank you also to Shiri and to Leonard for their really insightful and thought-provoking responses. I think the discussion will go on. We have a number of viewers on YouTube, and there'll be more, I think, after the fact as well, watching YouTube, and we keep the discussion going. Thank you again. And I want to thank Tao, who moderated the discussion on YouTube and you know, expertly put everything together and organized the whole show, really. Thank you, Tao. I think that's the end. So thank you again. Goodbye.
Thank you for the invitation, and thanks again to the respondents for your generous and thoughtful comments, and for taking the time to respond to my thoughts. I really appreciate it. Now I'll go to YouTube and see all the questions that I need to answer and what I got wrong. But Thanks and thanks to Tao for the invitation, and to the Science and Society Network for having me. It's a pleasure to be able to be in conversation with everybody in these somewhat circumscribed times. I appreciate it. That's it. Sign off. Be nice to be able to hang out and chat afterwards.